this is the third part of the 1950s series, which also gets into civil rights. And I know some of these events are in the next chapter, but I'm putting the whole civil rights movement together. So if you want to look up Selma, there is a section later on that deals with this. Okay, so we left off with, at the end, the Southern Manifesto, which was basically Southern congressmen, not only Southern people, but Southern congressmen pledging to oppose segregation now, segregation forever, led by our good friend Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. This was an immediate reaction to Brown versus Board of Education, which is a crucial turning point in American history because for the first time the Supreme Court says that segregation is by definition unconstitutional. Separate can never be equal. It is always by definition unequal. So the basic plan of attack after that point was nonviolent passive resistance. This is the complete and always the tactic of the civil rights movement. They copied Gandhi, of course, who got independence for India using nonviolent passive resistance. Most people don't know who Gandhi copied. Gandhi actually copied Henry David Thoreau. So this in long term is an American idea too. How do you oppose something you don't like? Not with violence, but with nonviolent passive resistance. How do you oppose it? You try to stop it from functioning non-violently. Sit-down strikes. Henry David Thoreau started by not paying his taxes because he didn't support the Mexican War. Of course, you have to have the punishment for that. You have to be willing to suffer the consequences, and he was thrown in jail for it. Okay, this is also a Christian tactic because it is nonviolent, and the civil rights movement was led by the Southern Christian Leadership Association, which was an organization of black Southern ministers with also some white ones as well. One of their key leaders was a young 26-year-old black minister from Atlanta, Georgia, who came from a family of sharecroppers and had gotten a divinity degree and a PhD. Martin Luther King. He also had 4 young children at the time. So what he did was come up with the idea of nonviolence united with legal challenges to local laws. So the two things are brought together in Martin Luther King. You don't have a choice of tactics because in the South, in the 1950s and 60s, African Americans did not have the guns. So you have to use another tactic. It is also very dangerous because for a long time there was no news coverage at first. So if there are consequences for this, nobody's going to find out about it. King was a great orator, incredibly charismatic, and one of his famous sayings, a number of them, we all know Martin Luther King, but how is this tactic going to succeed? Don't get weary, my children. We will wear them down by our capacity to suffer. This is nonviolent passive resistance. Okay, so one of the first places it happens, direct response to Brown versus Board of Education, was in Little Rock, Arkansas. Little Rock was actually a fairly liberal city, not in the Deep South, not completely segregated, but in 1957, for the first couple years we talked about after Brown versus Board of Education, nothing happened. When it began to be enforced, white parents across the South removed their children from public schools the minute African American children started showing up. So what do you do if you're a white Southerner and you don't want your child to go to an integrated school? This is called biting off your nose to spite your face. They pulled them out. Those who had money either hired a tutor or set up private schools. Private schools were fairly expensive now and then. If you were poor and white, your kid probably didn't go to school. So across the South for 4 or 5 years, there's a whole generation of Southerners who didn't get a complete education. Big surprise. Okay. So Little Rock Central High School, which was the one big high school in Little Rock, admitted in 1957 9 black students to attend. Actually, there were 10 and one chickened out at the last minute, so only 9 showed up the first day of school. 2 days before the semester starts, huge crowds of parents. If you look at the slides, you can see starting with 21, 21, and 22, Little Rock, large crowds of parents and out-of-state adults. And you'll notice in those crowds, the kids aren't in the crowds. The kids didn't have a problem with this. The parents did. They show up and begin picketing and agitating. We don't want black students in this school. The mayor of Little Rock, fake news. Information was given to the press that showed up that, and I'm quoting, stores are selling out of knives to African Americans. So the violence escalated. There was no violence on the African American side. The governor, who has this wonderful name, Orville Faubus, was running for re-election. You can imagine which side he stepped on. He supported the whites in this and opposed integration, and he called the Arkansas National Guard to keep order. Eisenhower gets wind of this in the news. It was broadcast nationally, and Eisenhower calls him up the night before the first day of class and said, "What is going on in Little Rock, Arkansas?" And basically, Governor Faubus tells Ike to butt out. This finally got Eisenhower to act, because Eisenhower is pretty much a hands-off guy. He finally got pissed off about this. He nationalized the National Guard, so now they were under federal control and they were ordered to protect the students. He also sent 1,000 federal paratroopers armed to Little Rock with bayonets. And the Little Rock Nine very famously attended school. The minute they showed up, the white students disappeared. So most of that school year, they attended an almost empty high school in Little Rock. But they finished the year. They continued on. Every single one of them went on to get a college degree, most of them involved in social occupations, and a number of them also completed graduate degrees. Okay, the federal court had ordered the governor of Arkansas, he had to integrate the schools. But this is the first time we have had federal troops in a southern state since the Civil War, and he called them Hitler's stormtroopers. These are federal troops, U.S. paratroopers. All Little Rock schools were closed rather than integrate, except for the high school. The black schools stayed open, and this happened across the South. Finally, Eisenhower spoke out openly to support integration. I'm quoting, "America cannot argue for free elections in foreign lands, like Eastern Europe, without meeting the challenge that in parts of America, qualified voters do not have access to the polls and children do not have access to schools." So Little Rock is the first key event. The second is the Montgomery Bus boycott. This is slides 26, 27, 28. We all know about Rosa Parks. And this was December 1955, 2 years before Little Rock happened. What we don't know about Rosa Parks is this was not a spontaneous event, as it's usually taught, that she just decided she was fed up one day. This was all arranged ahead of time. And Martin Luther King was a key organizer. Rosa Parks volunteered to do this. Why did she volunteer? She was single. She didn't have family. This was a crucial thing. Why did Martin Luther King come from Atlanta to run this boycott in Montgomery? He had no family in Montgomery. That was a key thing, again, because what was going to happen? Whites were going to attack his family. They were going to target his relatives. The house he was staying in Montgomery was bombed, was firebombed. His 4 little kids were there. They were not injured. Okay, so here's a public bus system. 75% of the bus riders in Montgomery were black. And if you look at that bus, you pay in the front, and this is a system we had in Chicago when I was a kid too. You paid for your, excuse me, bus ticket in the front, and then if you were black, you got out of the bus and you walked to the back door because you were not allowed to walk through the white section of the bus, which was the front part of the bus. Okay, this is crazy to us today. If the bus got full, any black person who had a seat in the back part of the bus had to get up and give his seat to a white person. Rosa Parks challenged this. She refused to give up her seat to a white rider. She was immediately arrested, taken downtown and arraigned, and the result was a bus boycott. So every African American in Montgomery pledged not to ride the bus. It lasted for 18 months until the bus company went broke, essentially. So it was nonviolent passive resistance, and it worked. What happened? African Americans for 18 months, and this is Alabama, it's a little hot in the summer, walked to work, walked to school, walked to wherever they had to go, or if they had a car, got a ride with friends. Mainly they walked, sometimes 5 and 6 miles in each direction. The people who bombed Martin Luther King's home, 2 of them were caught in the act. They were still acquitted even after they signed confessions. But it was a system that worked. It shut down the bus system. Nonviolent passive resistance, the goal is to close down the system, and it worked there. The next slide that you have is Birmingham, 29-30-31. Again, the tactic was nonviolent passive resistance. This is in the 1960s. These demonstrations, these boycotts were continuing on a low level all the way through the South. Birmingham is a turning point for a number of reasons. Number one, it was televised, and the nation sees this. And this is one of the first televised events. So, April 63, Birmingham is a very incredibly segregated city. At the time, the chief of police was appropriately named Bull Connor, and he would arrest anybody trying to integrate. They submitted an application to have a march. Bull Connor refused to sign the application, so this technically was an illegal march. They did not have a permit to march. Martin Luther King, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, asked volunteers from across the country. And looking at those slides, you can see it is not just African Americans in these marches. There were a number of whites who showed up as well. A lot of ministers, for one thing, showed up. A lot of social activists showed up. Socialists and a few communists showed up. Although, of course, communists did not have any organizational authority here. And thousands of people came. Martin Luther King leads it, and Bull Connor and his police department basically arrested everybody they could get their hands on. The participants had pledged jail, no bail. So when you are arrested and put in jail, they refused to get out on bail. What happens pretty quickly is the jails are overwhelmed. The next day, the marchers showed up again. Bull Connor arrests another 500 or 600. The next day, they show up again. They arrest another 400, 500, 600. And within a week, the jails in Birmingham are completely full. They set up basically chain link pens. A few days later, in the fields outside, Martin Luther King deliberately, as a tactic, asked children to come and march. So Bull Connor and his police force in Birmingham arrested 6,000 children from the ages of 6 to 16 as well. This is all going on the national news. On the 11th day of the marches, the violence escalated on the part of the police because the marchers had pledged no violence. This is a pretty dangerous tactic because it means you cannot defend yourself with violence either. You are helpless. They bring out the fire hoses. They bring out the police dogs. Even a federal marshal who had come to be an observer was arrested, and the assistant U.S. Attorney General, who had also come as an observer, he was also attacked in this riot that followed. Martin Luther King said afterwards from prison, those white mobs, they are our best friends. What does he mean? they got on television, and the entire nation saw what was going on in Birmingham and what had been going on in the South for generations. The immediate reaction is LBJ, president at the time, also, no, he's not, I'm sorry, JFK, president at the time, also sees this, also knows what's going on. The public was outraged. The public demanded changes for the first time. Coordinating with this, of course, is the 17 black churches that were bombed, 21 people injured, 4 little girls who had showed up early to practice for Sunday school were killed in one of the bombings. Everybody in town knew who the bombers were. They were never arrested. August of '63, immediately after Birmingham, is Martin Luther King's March on Washington, 250,000 turn out, and this is where Martin Luther King gives the famous speech that all of you have heard, "Free at last, and I have a dream that my little children will not grow up in a segregated society." Okay. The last event there is Selma, 25 and on that slide. Selma was in 1965. Selma is 54 miles from Montgomery. Montgomery was the capital of Alabama. And this is Selma to Montgomery, a march. What are they marching for? To register to vote. And if you have the time, there is a pretty good recent movie called Selma. And Oprah Winfrey is one of the starring characters in there. And the first scene in the movie is Oprah Winfrey is going in to register to vote. You can't vote unless you're registered. And how were they barring blacks from voting in the South up to this time? Poll taxes, grandfather clause, literacy test was used a lot. And Oprah Winfrey goes in, and she knows the routine because it's been tried many times. And the registrar says, okay, you can register to vote. First, I want you to name me all of the counties in Alabama, all 50 counties in Alabama. Well, she's ready for this. And she starts to name them in alphabetical order. And the registrar realizes she's memorized it all. She says, okay, now I want you to name the county seat, the main city in each of the counties in Alabama. Well, that was a new one, and she hadn't memorized it, so she was not allowed to vote. So Selma is an event where African Americans are trying to vote, to register to vote in the Capitol. There were 3 marches from Selma to Montgomery. The first was called Bloody Sunday. Martin Luther King led this again. Again, there were whites as well involved with this. And they cross the bridge from Montgomery leading to the highway to Selma, and they are attacked and turned back by armed local police, many of them on horseback. 3,000 people were arrested that day. Several people were killed. One of the people killed was a white minister who had come to participate in the march. There is a picture, I believe, on that slide of marchers being attacked, and you will see a young black guy in the front who has his hands over his head as a policeman is bearing down on him to beat him over the head. That is John Lewis. He was an organizer of young black college students who are participating in this, and he said, I thought I was going to die. He almost did. They cracked his head open. He was hospitalized for months. He recovered. He is now a senator from Georgia. So they didn't succeed the first day, but it gets on the news. And this time, this is LBJ as president. 2 days later, Martin Luther King leads the second march again. He got to the bridge. He stopped. Everyone stopped. He got down on his knees. He prayed, and he said, turn back. I can't have more blood on my hands. This is going to be violent again. So the second one was really a march that didn't take place. The third march was a couple days later. The governor of Alabama, Governor Wallace, refused to provide any protection, but LBJ has seen this on the news, and President Johnson sent 2,000 Army troops and federal marshals to protect the marchers. They marched. They had no problem. They were protected by federal troops, and they made it to Montgomery, and they registered to vote. Selma is the trigger for LBJ's request for a new Voting Rights Act. Again, why are we doing this? Because the country has seen it, and the country demands change. If you live in Minnesota or Iowa, you have no idea what's going on in the South. My generation, and this is a personal comment, my generation drives very quickly through Alabama these days. You will notice most of these events were in Alabama because my generation associates Alabama with really brutal conditions. I'm sorry if anybody's a native Alabaman here, but this is what happens. Okay, the rest of those slides there deal with Freedom Summer. This is 1963. Again, nonviolent passive resistance. What tactics were used? Sit-ins. Mixed black and white college students sat in on lunch counters in restaurants across the South. They sat in at schools. They sat in at businesses. This is a very effective tactic, and you have to be very brave because, of course, whites in the area would spit on them, throw things at them, call them every name in the book. But your goal was to sit there and not move and not to retaliate, even in self-defense. But if you're sitting at a lunch counter, and the first one was in North Carolina, if you're sitting at a lunch counter, no one else can be served. So eventually the restaurant's going to go broke unless they're served. But of course, if they're served, then your white patrons are going to be real mad at you. So the restaurant owners were in a terrible position. Freedom riders, also on interstate buses, not local buses, but interstate buses like Greyhound, mixed black and whites. Many of these buses were bombed and shot at. They had to put federal troops on the buses to protect the riders. But this is, again, nonviolent integration. The University of Alabama, one of the last in the nation, was finally integrated. The governor, George Wallace, segregation now, segregation forever, was standing in the doorway and said, basically, we will integrate over my dead body, and they had to carry him off. Federal marshals came and literally physically removed him from the doorway. The first black student at the University of Mississippi, 1962, James Meredith, was later assassinated in his front yard in front of his children. He had several little kids. Freedom Summer also involves, besides integrating establishments, restaurants, buses, schools, a large-scale effort to register Mississippi black voters. The Supreme Court in 1964 had declared the poll tax unconstitutional, and volunteers from the North, from northern states, young men and women, volunteered to go into rural Mississippi in the 1960s and register unregistered African Americans. As one black voter said, white America had spent so much effort denying the vote to blacks that there was good reason to believe they must be protecting something of vast importance. This was largely nonviolent, but you can imagine how courageous these guys are. They are kids your age who are going in groups of 2 and 3 in rural Mississippi in the 1960s to help African Americans. You can imagine how popular they were among the white population. It was nonviolent until 3 of them were brutally beaten to death and dumped in a river and found days later. At that point, many of the voter registration guys began to carry guns. And this is the beginning of the Black Power movement, where African Americans say, wait a minute, we are going to begin to fight back. So these 4 events were crucial in creating a movement to get the end of segregation, to begin integration and voter registration. Black organizations, there's a slide on that. I won't do too much with that. Basically, the NAACP is still around, still very active. What its goal was to get college educations for African Americans to train African American lawyers so they could challenge segregation in the courts. After World War II, the membership tripled. There were 1,000 branches with 500,000 members. We talked about the segregation problems. They worked on schools. They worked on segregating buses, on integrating buses, and particularly voting rights. 1932, 1% of Southern blacks were registered to vote. By 1950, 12% were registered. By 1960, 20%. Today, African Americans are the highest percentage of participants in elections, for good reason. It took a long time and a lot of fighting to get it. In 1944, the Texas all-white primary election was ruled unconstitutional. So what the NAACP is doing is legal challenges in the court to segregation, and very effective. Okay, so next time we are going to work on the 1960s, two key figures, JFK and LBJ. And the question is, as you read that chapter at the beginning of next week, is everybody around the world remembers JFK. Why doesn't anybody remember LBJ? And should they? Have a good weekend. Please stay safe.